what's wrong with a blame the victim mindset? And to put that more into words, all you have in this life is yourself and your effort. And, tough love is the way to go. We have to hold everyone to the same standards. And what that means is if you end up in prison because you committed a crime, well, so be it. You chose to commit that crime. Yeah. You chose to get someone pregnant at 16 years old, and I didn't. And that accounts for the difference between my life and yours. What is wrong with that simple, common sense mindset?
Yeah. Well, first of all, part of that is true. I mean, you do ultimately have to be responsible for your actions. There's no doubt about it. I wrote Agency particularly designed for young people 24 and under, like 12 to 24, middle school, high school, and your first few years of either college or young adulthood, because that 12-year span is when you're making the kinds of decisions that have lifelong implications, right? And it doesn't mean that if you can never recover from those decisions, but if we can get young people the information and supports they need during that period of time, it's also when brain development's occurring in a whole new way, we can usher in my view, a new age of agency. So the reason the blame the victim ideology is screwed up is that, there's some legitimacy in it, right? But if a kid doesn't have access to these institutions, I say agency is individually practiced, but socially empowered. So if you don't have access to a strong family, or if you grew up in in District 8, where only 2% of kids are graduating from high school ready for college, and the only school that you have access to is one of those schools that for generations has been operating that way, why would you think that we're going to get better outcomes for this new generation? I mean, I did some congressional testimony a few months ago on like economic outcomes. And these elected officials were obsessed with, adults that weren't able to buy houses, or they couldn't read a mortgage statement, or, they couldn't, the wealth gap. Like, okay, those are all real problems. But if you're choosing to intersect when people are adults coming out of school systems for which they are not educated well, they're not reading well, they can't do math well, they can't read a mortgage statement, then why would you expect different outcomes? And so the problem with blame the victim, it goes too far in stressing the element of personal responsibility. Like, I'm with it, but I think, and this is often my center-right colleagues, almost ignore. It's almost like the invisible help. It's the strength of your family. It's the support you get from your local faith community. It's the fact that you did have access to school choice, even if it wasn't policy. But those were things that shaped you and nurtured you, and we just can't ignore that. And I actually confess in the book that I was accused of blaming the victim, because I spent so much time talking about the importance of family structure. That I started getting attacked. And I started to just step back and say, you know what? I need to acknowledge that side of my argument that says that not everything is systemic, but not everything is on the individual. There has to be this third way. And so that's why I define agency as free will plus. And that plus has got to come from local institutions that have great proximity to a kid. The family you form, a personal faith commitment if you so choose, access to a high quality education. And if you got those three, this idea of entrepreneurship. So blame the victim is problematic because it doesn't acknowledge the necessity of local institutions that shape the moral fiber of the next generation.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think, how would I put this? People imagine the people that are taken in by this mindset imagine that if you had put them in a completely different subculture and location, they still would have ended up exactly who they are.
Right.
which is a total fiction. So like someone like me, for example, I grew up in a context with two parents that loved me and invested in me, where most people I knew had two parents that loved and invested in them, which is almost equally important, where the majority of adults that I knew had gone to college, where I had a family member, an uncle. I still have an uncle in prison, but nobody else that I knew that I was around on a day-to-day level was a career criminal or would even think of becoming a career criminal. So what was normal to me was graduating high school, going to college, not having children out of wedlock, getting married, and maybe having children. That was normal to me because it's what the great majority of people I was around of every race were doing. Now, if you put me in a scenario where I knew zero people that had gone to college, I knew several people that were in and out of prison, I knew very few people that had two parents in a home, and that whole constellation of lifestyle choices, you could say they're choices in because they are, but all of that just seemed far more normal to me than graduating high school, going to college, waiting till marriage to have a kid. Right? That all of that stuff would seem weird and strange and different, and it would and as social creatures, we are deeply influenced by simply the pattern of what people around us are doing. And that has a self-perpetuating logic to it, right? You don't need a reason. Most people don't need a reason to do what everyone around them is doing. That comes naturally to us. It's actually how we're wired in some ways. But you need to put in a lot of effort to do something different than what the people around you are doing. And so I think it's important for people who have these kinds of advantages that someone like myself does to think of something like, how hard would it have been for me not to graduate from high school? It would have actually required a lot of effort and swimming upstream with my parents, with my friends, with my teachers, with everyone around me would have come down on me like a fucking thunderbolt if I had decided to drop out of high school. It would have required effort to do it. There are lots of people for whom the exact opposite is true. It requires effort actually to finish at grade level, as much effort as it would have required for me to drop out. And that's just a fact.
So, when I started running schools in the South Bronx, this was 2010, I just thought, running great schools should be enough. And, we had great demand. We had huge wait lists on our schools. And we decided to move our headquarters from Tribeca in Manhattan to 149th Street and 3rd Avenue in the South Bronx. And this was in 2016, where I had another epiphany moment. July 11th, 2016, at about 4 p.m., we were doing a walking tour to get to know the neighborhood where we just moved. And as we were walking, we saw this 27-foot baby blue Winnebago truck with all these people around it that were very excited that it was there. And as we got closer to the truck, we saw that in graffiti lettering, it said, "Who's your daddy?" And like, what's that? And I did some research. It turns out that the Who's Your Daddy truck is a mobile DNA testing center where low-income folks are spending somewhere between $350 and $500 to answer questions like, are you my sister? Could you be my father? Like VH1 had a reality show. This is from my time at MTV when I'd done shows like 16 and Pregnant. VH1 had a reality show called Swab Stories on the truck because it was like entertainment, because they were swabbing people to, is Joey going to learn who his real father is, And so this was entertainment. And yet here was this truck that was being celebrated in this community. And this guy was an entrepreneur. It was He had added another truck because demand was so high. As I learned, the non-marital birth rate in this community was 85%, and so I just started to realize, gosh, for most of these kids, as much as a great education as we're providing, we have to address this somehow. Because just to your point, if you don't see any models by which you can make a difference in your own life, it's just really hard. And so I started talking about this data. It's called the success sequence. It says if you finish your high school degree, then get a full-time job of any kind, just you learn the dignity and discipline of work. And if you have children, marriage first. 97% of people who follow that series of decisions avoid poverty. And the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond. So we started teaching this and we got massive pushback. You can't teach that. Sure, that's data, but how do you actually make this real for kids who don't see that every day? And so that's when I started getting the whole blame the victim accusation. Yeah, you're putting data out into the world, but you're not helping kids actually realize what each of these things mean. If you live in a neighborhood where that's everything you're seeing, yeah, that's a lot easier. But come down, translate this for life in this part of town or in Appalachia or parts of Chicago, where you can say the data all you want, but if the kids aren't in an environment where they're seeing this, you have to make it real in some way. So I just want to echo the point that, and this is a lot to my center-right colleagues, we can talk about these things, but we have to figure out ways to make this real in the communities that we really want to serve.
So in your book, you highlight the problems with the blame the system narrative, with the blame the victim narrative, which we just did, and then you sketch a third way. Can you describe that third way?
Yeah, you can't just shout in the rain. I mean, you have to put forth ideas that work in the real world. That's why I run schools. I want my kids to know that they can do hard things. I want to run institutions that say, well, did it work, your ideas? And so kids need a framework, in my view, that shows them that they will face barriers, but there are strategies to overcome. They will face systemic barriers. So there is blame the system. I mean, there are laws that ban school choice in New York City. That's a real systemic barrier, right? So, but they need a framework to understand how I can be successful, while also knowing that there's a framework that they can take personal responsibility, but that they don't have to do it alone, and that there are institutions. So for me, that framework is free: family, religion, education, entrepreneurship. My hope is that free becomes a framework that young people can embrace, that highlights their individual asset, the individual strengths that they can deploy, even in the face of identity groupings that are telling them all the things that they cannot do. So free is family. It's not about the family that you're from. It's about the family that you form. R is about religion, personal faith commitment. E is about education. And in that, this whole idea of school choice is central. And then the last E is about entrepreneurship. If you form a strong family, have a strong faith commitment, strong education through educational choice, you are much more likely to be an informed risk taker in your own life. And your ability to solve problems, whether it be your own work, building your own business, solving problems within your community, you have an entrepreneurial mindset. But that doesn't just come from nowhere. So what I'm trying to highlight is this idea that agency is individually practiced, but socially empowered. That social empowerment has to come from the most local mediating institutions, from the environment. So this isn't like, a federal government top-down program. This is more about animating the local institutions within your neighborhood that help drive your ultimate success. Free.